today's Nutshell Talk, we're going to be hearing from Matt Smith, who's the research program lead at the USDA National Agroforestry Center, and also Sam Feibel, who's the technical assistant in science delivery fellow at the USDA National Agroforestry Center. And they've been doing incredible work on the National Agroforestry Producers Survey. This is the first comprehensive national survey on agroforestry. And today they're going to be talking specifically about some of their findings that are relevant to the West Coast. So I'm really excited to hear from Matt and Sam today. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, Matt and I are both excited to talk to everyone today, and we're going to be presenting on insight from the Census of Agriculture and the National Agroforestry Producers Survey. Um, I'll be starting with the census, which is sort of a less detailed, larger pool of data from which the producer survey was taken as a subsample. So, and this is not, I have some maps of California we can look at, but there's not a ton that can be pulled out from this specific to California, but I'm going to share the data and sort of some of the big picture takeaways and some of the resources that you all can go explore on your own to see how it may be relevant to the work that you're doing in California or whatever the states you come from in the region. So, um, so this is a paper we published at the center a little over a year ago. Agroforestry across the United States, results of the 2022 Census of Agriculture. If you use this QR code here, it'll take you to a web page on our site, on the NAC website, which you can find a link to the paper from there, as well as a link to the underlying data in the Forest Service Research Data Archive. You could explore it on your own, on your own computer. And there's also an interactive tool there to allow you to explore these maps, which we'll take a quick look at during this presentation. So what this all represents is for the first time, data is available on agroforestry implementation across the United States that allows for comparison across time. And these data come from a single question on the Census of Agriculture, which is administered every 5 years by the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, USDA NASS. So this question is, you can see here, at any time in 2022, did this operation practice alley cropping, silvopasture, or forest farming, or have riparian forest buffers or windbreaks? So because this question combines these multiple practices, we're not able to get a picture of practice-specific data we cannot pull out from this survey. That's a little bit of what Matt will get into with the producer survey later, but and the Census of Agriculture reports on all farm operations from which $1,000 or more of agricultural products were produced and sold, or normally would have been sold during the census year. So what we saw looking at this, and this question first appeared in the 2017 Census of Agriculture. There was a question about some of the agroforestry practices in the 2012 census, but because it was not an identical question, didn't list all these practices, we can't compare that over time. But this was the first time since the 2017 census question we were able to actually look at change over time, which is really exciting. So we did see agroforestry is increasing across the United States. 1.72% of all farm operations have agroforestry. And this is totals to 32,717 farm operations with at least one agroforestry practice, which is up from a little under 31,000 in the 2017 Census of Ag, which is a 6% increase. So for some context, these numbers, on the national scale seem pretty small, but to put it in context, you look at the number of certified organic farms, 17,048, farms that produce berries, similar number there, 35,000. So it's interesting to sort of see what agroforestry compares to here. And so broadly, why are we interested in understanding agroforestry extent? So having this repeat data set enables trend analysis, so we can see where agroforestry is increasing, decreasing at the county level. We can understand where agroforestry maybe is not or has decreased, or where there's interest in agroforestry to better match financial and technical assistance to support demand for agroforestry, identifying hotspots, which can help identify future areas for survey research and additional research. Um, Help support program and policy evaluation, informing decision making about future policies, funding, programs, extension delivery. So to show one of these maps here at the state level, we can see number of farm operations reporting agroforestry. And this is a bit relative to the number of farms in the state, size of the state. Um, you can break that down to the county level. You really start to see some areas where there seem to be hotspots of agroforestry. Going through these a bit quickly, but I'll show the tool where everyone can explore these on their own. It's also really interesting to look at percent of farm operations reporting agroforestry, not just the raw numbers, so we can see sort of the relative proportion of farms with agroforestry in a county. You have a lot here in the Northeast, also some here in Pacific Northwest, across Appalachia and other areas. So some of these regional hotspots, just to pick out a few. So Vermont had the highest percent of farms with agroforestry at 7.8%, followed by Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Hawaii. And then the lower spots tended to be in the more arid, semi-arid states. And we actually did, in the paper, mention we overlaid climate zones on this census data and could see that it was 44% of counties that reported no agroforestry were in arid or semi-arid climate zones, where agroforestry may be less suitable in some instances. So just wanted to pull the California maps here for this audience. So we have a number of farms reporting agroforestry in 2022. It's kind of interesting. We can zoom in the other map, but Marin County there's a good bit of agroforestry. Looking at percent of farms as well. Sorry to go through these kind of quickly, but these maps are really getting at that trend analysis. We can see agroforestry is growing, where it is growing and where it is decreasing at the county and state level. So we tended to see more increase on the eastern half of the country and more decrease towards the western half. And so, when you look at the county level, you can really see that, there may be opportunities for folks to learn from their neighbors and sort of spread agroforestry at that more local level. So, and we have that map for California as well. And across every census of ag, the number of farms across the country in total is decreasing, largely due to farm consolidation. But so before, I suppose, I think I'll let Matt present his thing. I don't want to jump out of the slide, but if we have a minute when we're done, I'd love to show the tool to everyone, and I'll share that web link.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so when looking at our data from the National Agroforestry Producers Survey, we sent that national survey out in 2022, and it's taken quite a few years to analyze the data and summarize it. But we have a series of manuscripts coming out in the next few weeks and months. The windbreak manuscript should be out probably next week. And so we'll make sure that Catherine shares that link to everyone in this group so folks have access to it. But just to provide a little bit about the survey itself, we used the 2017 Census of Agriculture as a sample frame. And so we pulled our respondents randomly and by state from that 2017 sample. And so we ended up sending the survey to over 11,000 producers, so 36% of the entire population. We got 5,600 people respond. So we had a 52% response rate, which is really great. And so we actually have data for 18% of all the folks with agroforestry in the United States for the National Agroforestry Producer Survey. And one important point to mention is since we more or less oversampled, our margin of error on this is very low. It's at plus or minus 1%. And what that means is when you look at the following slides, when there's a percent, just imagine plus or minus on that percent, up or down. And we have about 150 respondents for California. Next slide, Sam. And so this is a very busy slide, but I wanted to show everyone the amount of data we have for each agroforestry practice that was in the survey. And so we had windbreak and hedgerows, silvopasture, riparian forest buffers, alley cropping, and forest farming. And if you look at the column on the far left, you can see all the various types of data we have for every one of these practices. And so we have the distribution across the United States, sub-practices used, acres, establishment and management activities, information sources, funding sources. We also asked folks about benefits and challenges, and then a subsequent question that asked them to rank those benefit and challenges. We asked people about markets, future intentions, tree species used, crops used, and livestock used. And again, this is a very large table, but it's just showing the types of data that we have that are going to be publicly accessible to everyone in the coming weeks. And just for reference, those little red X's represent what I'm going to touch on very, very briefly today. Next slide. So we'll first start with windbreaks. So as I said, for every agroforestry practice, we have one of these maps showing how many producers were in our sample that had that specific agroforestry practice. And we also have maps on the percent of the agroforestry population within that state that has agroforestry. So when looking at windbreaks, we had about 2,700 respondents. And windbreaks were the most common agroforestry practice when looking at the entire United States. And the average acres in windbreaks was about 10 acres. And this did vary by farm production region. And just for reference, a lot of our data we weren't able to analyze based on state because of number of respondents. And so we lumped them into farm production region. And so for you folks in California, the farm production region where we analyzed your data more or less was in the Pacific. So it combined California with Oregon and Washington. Next slide. And one of the other questions we asked for windbreaks, and also we asked a similar question for alley cropping and also silvopasture, was what kind of subtype do you have of this practice? And so for windbreaks, we had field, farmstead, livestock, boundary, living snow fence, hedgerow, and also multiple windbreak types on the same farm. And again, California, I'm not showing the data here, but of course, hedgerows was more prominent in California than any other state. Next slide. Jumping into silvopasture. One of the questions we asked for silvopasture was livestock species used. And so we had 24 different livestock species used across the country. The most common was cattle at 74% of producers reporting that. The second most, which we found surprising, was horses. Although when we actually looked at the data for horses, a majority of those producers were also using other livestock species as well, such as cattle or sheep or goats. And so 60% of producers reported using only one livestock species, though we did find a number where grazing multiple species at the same time. Though we're not quite sure if they're grazing multiple species in the same paddock or different paddocks, and that's just a question we're going to ask differently on the next iteration of this survey. Next slide. So for every agroforestry practice, we have this type of diagram right here that's showing what percent of respondents sold a very specific product like medicinal, edible, or livestock, what percent plan to sell, and then also what percent use those products for personal or on-farm use. And so for silvopasture, 96% of respondents indicated that they have sold, plan to sell, or use products from their silvopastures. There was a number of producers that also reported creating a silvopasture for wildlife food plots, and that's why that percent is not at 100%, is because there's a number of folks that were using it for other purposes. When we look at those green bars in terms of what people are using most frequently from their silvopastures, it was firewood. When we look at the blue portion of the bars, in terms of sold products, it was livestock products that are most often sold. Next slide. Next up, riparian buffers. And again, I'm just going to go through all these really quickly just to show you what kind of data we have for each of the practices. So for riparian forest buffers, we looked at conservation benefits and economic benefits, and this is true for all the practices. But for buffers in particular, we wanted to really look at the proportion that were receiving benefits that are more conservation oriented than economic. And you can see that wildlife habitat, improved erosion control, some of these conservation benefits were received by an overwhelming majority of producers. And then also, if you looked at the ranked benefits, conservation type benefits were high priority. What we found interesting, though, was the economic benefits were still relatively high for riparian forest buffers, which is really interesting. And there's been numerous studies showing that productive conservation tends to last on the landscape longer. And more recently, we're hearing about productive buffers. And this is one of those trends that will be interesting to track over time, whether or not the economic benefits we see here, which are not that high, but are they going to increase over time as more and more folks are interested in these productive buffers? Next slide. Jumping to alley cropping. So I think one of the biggest take-home messages from alley cropping from this national survey, we had 388 respondents and 250 provided data on the distinct tree and crop combinations they used. There was incredible variability across the United States. So if we had 250 people, we had 408 distinct tree and crop combinations. And that number is likely much, much higher because a number of producers were reporting genus level information. So the number of distinct combinations is likely much higher. And this is just interesting from a research and technical assistance perspective in terms of there's a lot going on and a lot of variability by region. And it's just how do we tackle that issue of system diversity while making recommendations and pursuing different research activities. And so it's just something that we're going to have to tease apart as a agroforestry community in terms of what we're recommending and what we're considering pursuing for research, just because anything under the sun seems to go with what people are doing in their alley cropping system. Next slide. For all the agroforestry practices, we have data on where folks were selling their products. And for alley cropping, it was unique compared to the other agroforestry practices in that direct consumer was one of the primary mechanisms, especially farmers markets and food distributors, farm stand and store, and UPIC, and also CSAs. This graphic for the other agroforestry practices was more or less flipped. In terms of like windbreaks and buffers, it was forest products that were the dominant ones sold. So this was unique in terms of a lot of food type production for alley cropping, which does make sense. Next slide. On to forest farming. So for forest farming, this slide is looking a little wonky, but maybe that's just on my end. So we asked a question for every agroforestry practice about what challenges you receive, but also what are the most important challenges. And so if you look at the blue bars, that is challenges experienced in general. And if you look at the orange part of the bars on this mirror graph, is what are the most important challenges. And for most agroforestry practices, the top three for challenges experienced and most important were all the same. It was added labor and management complexity, high startup costs, and also expensive maintenance. And so this was true for almost every agroforestry practice. And I think when we look at the survey in general with all 5,800 agroforestry respondents, I think that's one of the bigger take-home messages is labor cost, maintenance, being high across the board. And I think this represents really interesting research and also technical assistance opportunity on how can we reduce system costs while still managing a diversified system. So again, that's just one of those interesting trends we've seen across all practices. Next slide. And any questions for Samurai? And I think that QR code goes to our website. And a quick thing on the National Agroforestry Center. So we have a large, more or less online warehouse of how-to decision support tools and just agroforestry information and data. So again, check out our website and always feel free to ping us if you have any questions. We're more than happy to help folks out and also learn from you folks and what you're doing on your farms and operations.
And I'll put this link here for everyone, but this is just that tool real quick. You can go here and you can search your county, um, and you can explore this census data that I was presenting on.
Thank you, Matt and Sam. That was so informative. And I certainly have a lot of questions, but let's open it up to anyone else for questions.